Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Working Group for BAA Level Market Power Mitigation. My name is Brenda Marquez on behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs at the California ISO. We welcome you to our call. Today, we'll go ahead and kick things off with a few meeting reminders as this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. As well, we do have these meetings structured to stimulate dialogue and engage diverse perspectives. We also encourage comments to be professional and respectful for both the panelists and attendees. Also, please refrain from repeating anything that was previously said in order for us to manage our time effectively during this call. To ask a question during the WebEx, you will utilize the raise hand icon above your chat window. You'll be added to the queue. Once you're added to the queue, keep your hand raised. We'll unmute you and make sure to state your full name and affiliation before saying your comment. If you are dialed in just through mobile device phone line, you'll just utilize *3. This will help you be added to the queue as well. Our event producer is Ahmed, and him and I will be monitoring chat as well any questions coming in. Be mindful when you do submit a chat question, it goes to all panelists, so everyone in the team will be able to see those questions as well. Today, just an overview on the agenda today. We do have Sylvie Spiewak, our Senior Policy Developer, who will be kicking off most of this call. We have Danny Johnson, who is our Market Design Sector Manager, who's here supporting, as well as James Frederick, who is a Lead Policy Developer for most of the Price Formation Enhancements Working Group structure with the other topics as well. And so the team will be covering a little bit on stakeholder comments that will be presented on a few slides, and then Sylvie will also dive in through principles and problem statements. And lastly, there will be another few sections on ISO structural and PM design. And then we'll wait for our speakers to kind of allow for those times for questions. So keep an ear out to hear those times for those moments and pausing. So then after that, we'll close out this call. And then my last slide to present is just a stakeholder overview of what we have with the proposal development phase. We are kind of moving towards later this month to hopefully post a paper. James has addressed that for a few of the topics, so you can see those reference material from the initiative webpage under California ISO, under Stakeholder Center, and then you'll click on Price Formation Phase 2. So I'll send that link on the chat in a moment, so you'll be able to see all the material. And then we also get the slides posted hopefully soon. So I'll make sure everyone has access to that during this meeting. But at this time, we'll be having this slide presented, and then we'll go on from there. At this time, I go ahead and introduce Sylvie, who will be kicking us off. And then go ahead, Sylvie. Just want to do a quick audio check before you begin.
Is my audio working okay?
Perfect. Thank you.
Excellent. So I wanted to kick things off by reviewing a few areas of feedback that we wanted to focus on specifically today and the goals of today's presentation. So the two areas of feedback from the BAA level market power mitigation stakeholder calls that we had back in November of last year, I think it was, are around an impact test and questions around the competitive LMP. So stakeholder comments on considering an impact test, we largely saw support for continued discussion, but a lot of different perspectives on what the value of an impact test might bring and how we could design an impact test given the ISO's MPM design today. Some perspectives I saw on what the value of an impact test might be included the potential for it to lower the frequency of mitigation, although some stakeholders noted that frequency doesn't mean that there's an impact to a supplier's offer price. Some stakeholders noted that it could lower the degree of impact to mitigated bids, while others noted that this today really depends on the DEB and the CLMP, and we could consider those, we can consider solutions around those tools as well. Some stakeholders questioned if there was a correlation of mitigation with overall price levels. Does that indicate a problem? If so, what problem? And some noted that this could improve outcomes for non-pivotal suppliers. A couple of questions I saw for consideration included how and when would an impact test be applied? How would the mitigation procedure change for bids that fall above and below the impact threshold? How should the threshold be determined? Is it even feasible to design an impact threshold based on salient or dynamic system conditions? So to answer some of these questions and dig into the design, I actually have included a couple of potential formulations of an impact test at the end of this presentation that we can talk about. Before diving into that, I wanted to also review the competitive LMP. The general flavor of comments in this area identified a need to align conceptually on the definition of a competitive LMP to better understand what the goal of the competitive LMP was, so that we could inform the process around determining how the competitive LMP is set and assessing the outcome of that process. There were a couple of specific concerns that I saw with the competitive LMP, including needing clarity on how the BAA level versus the local market power mitigation competitive component interacts. So I'll directly address that question today, and concerns that there may be instances of when a competitive LMP may not exist. So today we're going to talk about these two concepts, the competitive LMP and the impact test. And in order to do that, I'll talk about how the competitive LMP is set and some opportunities to improve the competitive LMP. And we'll also talk about the potential value for integrating an impact test into the ISO's existing market power mitigation design. And then I've teed up additional conversations to come off of this larger goal, which might include considerations of the grouping approach and pivotal supplier tests in this context. Before diving in, the classic principles and problem statements, because I love principles and problem statements, I thought we should start here, but also there's some terms and some basic principles that I'll allude to throughout this presentation. Nothing crazy, just at a high level. I first wanted to define market power. So a supplier can exercise market power by increasing its offer price over cost. And in competitive conditions, in theory, supply with an uncompetitive offer wouldn't be dispatched. So an attempt to economically withhold or to submit inflated offers would have no impact on market outcomes and wouldn't be a profitable venture. In uncompetitive conditions, if a supplier has the ability to exercise market power, the supplier would be able to profit from an uncompetitive offer price. And so the principle underlying market power mitigation design is this. If a supplier has no ability to exercise market power or has adequately mitigated this ability, then it can be paid market-based prices, market-based as opposed to cost-based. In other words, if a supplier has the ability to exercise market power, then it should not be paid market-based prices. Throughout this presentation, I will allude to two problem statements, and they are just these two types of error. And we've talked about these before. Type 1 is false positive. So this type of error can occur if the test identifies market power when there is none. And this may result in over-mitigating offers. Type 2 error is false negative. This can occur when the test fails to identify market power, and that can result in economic withholding, which can impact market prices. Just wanted to note that the potential for these types of error doesn't necessarily indicate the impact of error. And so we can talk about solutions that either address the root cause, so attempt to reduce the frequency of type 1 and 2 error, or solutions that mitigate the impact of error when it occurs, and both of them are equally as effective. And I'm going to break down the conduct and impact versus the way the MPM design is today into this basic structure on how to design a market power test. First, we're going to define the relevant market. Then we're going to define what a competitive offer is. And then we'll talk about the conditions when market power should be mitigated. So diving into the ISO's design, and I called it structural here. I was told earlier this afternoon that structural might not be the right word for this, but what I really mean, how I mean to characterize the ISO's design is that it's not a financial assessment. It is an assessment of limitations in the market that prevent competitive supply from reaching a particular area. So when we define the relevant market, we're going to talk about physical limitations to competitive supply and scheduling limitations to competitive supply, or local market power and BAA level market power. Next, we're going to talk about two different ways to define a competitive offer. Our market power design uses two distinct proxies, the default energy bid and the competitive LMP. Finally, we'll talk about when market power should be mitigated. And there are two conditions that need to hold. Suppliers have the ability to exercise market power, but also there needs to be an indication that the offer level represents economic withholding. So first, defining the relevant market. Both procedures, LMPM and BAA level market power, include this test, the DCPA, and the 3 pivotal supplier test. And they identify the competitive contribution to the competitive LMP. But local market power mitigation and BAA level market power mitigation differ in terms of the market definition, i.e. the barrier to reducing access to competitive supply, and what the contribution to the CLMP is. So in local market power mitigation, competition is constrained by physical transmission constraints, whereas BAA level market power mitigation, competition is constrained by scheduling limitations. Under local market power mitigation, the relevant constraint impacts the congestion component, whereas in BAA level market power mitigation, the relevant constraint impacts the BAA's marginal energy cost. A little bit of background on physical versus scheduling limits. We're going to talk about interties. There's an intertie between two BAAs, and it can be made up of multiple physical scheduling points or multiple physical transmission lines. The ISO nets intertie transfers for modeling and settlement purposes. So BAA to BAA interties can be viewed as the sort of modeling convention that's based on but does not fully or practically get captured by individual metered transmission lines. And this is especially true because the constraint on an intertie is dictated by scheduling limitations and not physical limitations. And so there's a need to consider the power balance constraint separately from transmission congestion. WEAM transfer constraints typically bind due to scheduling limits, and these are often lower than physical transmission limitations. So if we looked at the transmission limitations only, we'd be missing a source of, or a limitation preventing competitive supply. A binding transmission constraint cannot be used to indicate whether a BAA level has access to competitive external supply. And this is because, or another way to understand this is that a BAA can access external supply even if it's a constraint on the border binds, because there may be multiple scheduling points. And an otherwise unconstrained BAA might be closed off from external competitive supply due to a constraint on a different border. So you really need to more holistically assess where the limitation is or how the scheduling limitation binds as opposed to looking at an individual scheduling point. And this binding scheduling limit is what inevitably restricts competitive supply and can create price separation. Any questions about this so far?
Yes, Sylvie, we do have a question from PG&E. JK Wang asks if you can elaborate what is defined as scheduling limits.
So on an intertie, there's a scheduling limit that we use for reliability purposes, for contingency planning, et cetera. And so it's going to be, say, the physical limitation of an intertie or of multiple transmission lines is 1,000 megawatts. The scheduling limitation might be 800 megawatts. And that's to make sure there's room for reliability purposes, for contingencies, for other reasons that maybe my team has more details on. But the idea is that we schedule lower than the physical constraint.
And we do got a raised hand from Callie Wells. Let's go ahead and take hers. And then we also have James. James, would you like to add first before Callie? I just want to make sure if that was the question.
Thank you. I just want to add on that scheduling limits may also manifest themselves as financial scheduling rights over interties. And so thus are not physical limits, but actually sort of contractual limits on power that can flow across an intertie as well. Thanks.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Quick question back on the slide where I think you were showing a table that tried to differentiate between the physical and the scheduling limit. This one, perfect. So I think what I hear you saying in terms of trying to distinguish between local market power mitigation and BA level market power mitigation, this table, is that for BAA, the relevant constraint is a power balance constraint, whereas in local market power mitigation, the relevant constraint are the individual component, the transmission lines that impact the congestion component. Am I understanding what you're trying to capture here?
Yes.
Okay, so this is something that I always struggle with in trying to make the distinction between these two. And it kind of goes back to the way I'm thinking about how maybe the pivotal supplier test might apply for BA level market power mitigation. But at a very high level, is it really the relevant constraint, the power balance constraint, or are you talking, or is it more the MEC? Because if I recall under EDAM, the only reason we're going to have different MECs, which is the trigger for the BA level market power mitigation, is when a transfer constraint is binding. So it's not necessarily a power balance constraint, it's transfer constraints.
So you've nailed it in a lot of ways. In EDAM, we'll be calculating a MEC for each BA. So each BA will have its own power balance constraint. And so the intertie, the scheduling limitation in and out of a BA is going to impact the power balance constraint.
Is it directly impacting? It's really though the shadow price on the transfer limits that's causing the MECs to differentiate. So this is something that again that I struggle with this design and distinction, because in EDAM, you know, we always question why the shadow price on the transfer constraints was added to the SMEC as opposed to just being a separate congestion component or adding it into the congestion component itself. We never really, I guess, bought into the idea of needing different MECs across the system. So I think it's a really important distinction, because it's not really different power balance constraint shadow prices, but for the fact that you're adding the transmission or the transfer constraint shadow prices to them to create that difference. But I appreciate you confirming that I'm understanding that distinction you're trying to make, because it's something that I think might impact possibly different ways to calculate the pivotal supplier test, but I'll hold off on that till we get to that point.
Yeah, I hear your wheels are turning in the same way that I was. So I tried to explain it in a couple of different ways, and this slide gets toward how you were thinking as well, where we were thinking about the MEC separately from congestion. And another way to think about this is that all resources that are inside a BA provide counterflow to the power balance constraint, and the MEC is the power balance constraint shadow price. But each resource within a BA might have different shift factors relative to a local constraint. And so we have the MEC and we have congestion. Another way to think of this distinction is to think about how if you don't have any internal congestion in a BA, a supplier with market power could still impact energy prices via the power balance constraint if they have market power. And in a largely competitive BA, there might be suppliers that are able to exercise market power, but only within constrained load pockets.
Yeah, okay. And I guess another way to think about it in my mind is you have a true SMEC, then you have the congestion component from internal constraints, and then you have a congestion component from transfer constraints.
You know, I think they're one and the same in terms of just you can getting there in different ways. So today we have a single SMEC, and then from the SMEC, you can decompose the LMP in each place, the LMP components in each place, but going from that to a MEC in each BA doesn't change LMPs anywhere. It just changes the math that it takes to figure out what the components are. So when we go to a MEC for each BA, it just becomes more transparent what the difference between these two separate types of market power are.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Mathematically, it all ends up the same, but when we get to like the actual formulation on the pivotal supplier test, breaking those out into a SMEC, congestion because of the transfer constraints and congestion because of internal constraints, might help the conversation at that point. So I know mathematically it's the same, but that's just a way I've been thinking about it. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, let's talk about that more when we talk about the 3 pivotal supplier tests.
When I do see Danny and George, they may like to add on to this question.
Before I turn it over to George, Sylvia, I wanted to add to your articulation. It would be the shadow price of the net transfer constraint, not a single transfer constraint between 2 EDM BAAs, because you can have multiple transfer points which form an amalgamated scheduling point, and internal resources would have different shift factors to all of those individual constraints. To the extent all of those constraints are binding, they would all have a 100% shift factor to the net transfer constraint. But I'd also like to hear what George has to say.
Thank you, Danny. This is George Angelidis with the SO. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on this to clear out the question of how does the marginal energy cost relate to the shadow price on a transfer scheduling limit. I think this is what comes up often here. And I'll try to explain in a simple way. The marginal energy cost, everybody knows, is the shadow price of the power balance constraint for a balancing authority area. Now, if you have a transfer between 2 BAAs that hits its transfer scheduling limit, if there are other parallel transfers between these 2 BAAs, and let's consider only 2 BAAs in the market footprint here for simplicity, if the other transfers are not at the scheduling limit, then the fact that this particular transfer is at the scheduling limit doesn't mean anything. The shadow price is 0 because there's still available power schedule that can flow between these 2 BAs on the other transfers. What happens that leads to price separation between the 2 BAAs is if all the parallel transfers between them, all of them one by one hit the scheduling limit. All right, so now the shadow price on any of those transfer scheduling limits is the same. And it's the value that creates the price separation between the marginal energy costs between the two BAAs. So now the two BAs have different marginal energy costs, and the difference between those two marginal energy costs is exactly equal to the saddle price on any of these binding transmission scheduling limits. So I just wanted to clear this out. I hope this is satisfying the question and how the two are related. Thank you.
Thanks, George. Let's keep going because I have some examples in here, not necessarily of this per se, but an example that I do want to get through. The punchline here is this. There were a couple of questions on how the BAA versus the local market power mitigation component interacts in a competitive LMP, and here's your answer. The competitive LMP equals the competitive MEC, which we get from BAA level market power mitigation, plus the competitive congestion component, which we get from local market power mitigation. A couple of click downs that I think might be helpful include that the competitive LMP, you can think about this as the competitive LMP in a competitive area would just be the LMP. And there could be a distinct competitive LMP for each location. But at the end of the day, the takeaway is really that local market power alone is insufficient to address all market power mitigation concerns. So we have defined the relevant market. Now we're going to talk about the two different proxies that we use in mitigation. Today's call does not focus on the DEB, but I do just want to plug that we have a default energy bid, and this reflects resource-specific cost-based offers. A cost-based offer is the cost of providing incremental energy, and it excludes things such as like out-of-market hedging and financial uncertainty, but I won't get into that. Just note that there's a cost-based offer, and this is really intended to proxy a resource's competitive offer into the market. DEBs are calculated once per market, so you've got a day ahead if you're a day ahead participant and a real-time DEB, and it applies to all 24 hours of the relevant market unless a scheduling coordinator requests adjustments. Most DEBs include a multiplier, and the multiplier is designed to cover the potential for cost variation that might occur throughout the day based on the inputs to the DEB. So DEB multipliers can be tailored to be technology specific, which I'll show in the next slide, and can also be customized based on historical observations of cost variation. For example, gas resources with a variable cost DEB include a 110% multiplier, and we came up with this based on observations of aggregate historical gas price volatility. The hydro DEB has a couple of different multipliers for the gas floor versus short-term versus long-term opportunity costs. These are 110 and 140%. The battery storage DEB option includes a 110% multiplier, and this was designed or intended to address the potential for variation between day ahead and real-time prices and reduce issues from intraday opportunity costs. So this DEB multiplier accounts for resource-specific cost variation that might occur throughout the day. Let's compare that to the competitive LMP. The competitive LMP reflects interval-specific competitive conditions. This is a market-based price, and it is the market price in structurally competitive areas. And so this serves as a different proxy. It serves as a proxy for dynamic competitive market conditions, whereas a DEB may not capture all dynamic market conditions in every interval. It applies to the full 24 hours. So using a competitive LMP in mitigation allows offers in the market that reflect the value above the DEB in some cases, as long as we can show that that offer doesn't impact competitive market outcomes. And an important takeaway here is that high prices don't necessarily indicate a lack of competition. High prices might reflect opportunity costs or tight conditions in commodity markets like gas price volatility. So the CLMP is a good way to proxy those conditions if they occur. So the rule that we use for mitigation is that bids above the CLMP are mitigated to the higher of the DEB or the CLMP, but bids below the CLMP get away with not being mitigated. And I'm going to continue with this example in the next section, but I'll just quickly go through it. There's 3 units. Bid 1 is $35 because it's below the CLMP. We pass that off to the market. Unit 2 bids $50. This is above the CLMP. But the DEB is below the CLMP, so we mitigate to the CLMP. Unit 3 bids above the CLMP. We mitigate that down to the DEB. And just to put a little more color around this, you can imagine that maybe unit 2 is a gas or a battery storage resource, and the CLMP is capturing some of those intraday prices that the DEB might not. All right, before I move on to defining the conditions when market power should be mitigated, any questions about the 2 separate proxies that we use in mitigation?
So, Sylvie, we did get a question, just I'm not sure if it's for this topic, but is competitive MEC the MEC of CAISO BAA from PG&E? So they asked the question.
No, George, do you want to hop in? Can we unmute George?
Thank you. No, in the BAA level mitigation proposal, there is no balancing authority area that is considered to be a reference, essentially considering the marginal energy cost for that balancing authority area to be a competitive price. All the BAAs and groups are going through the evaluation of whether the group is competitive or not, even if it includes the ISO. So there's no such assumption. This assumption exists in today's EIM BAA level mitigation, where the California ISO Balancing Authority area is taken as a reference, and that's why we have the system marginal energy cost in EIM today, which is the marginal energy cost of the ISO, actually. It's the shadow price of the ISO power balance constraint. So in today's EIM, yes, the marginal energy cost of the ISO balancing authority area is considered a competitive price because there's the assumption that the ISO balancing authority area is a competitive BAA today in EIM. But here in the EDM proposal, we don't make such an assumption. We examine every BAA group, whether it's competitive or not. And eventually, through this grouping and evaluation, we arrive at a point to determine which is the competitive LMP. If we find a group that becomes competitive, then the lowest marginal energy cost of the BAs in the group is the competitive LMP that can be used for mitigation of bids in BAAs in that group that have been previously found uncompetitive. Thank you.
So George, today, sorry, stay on the line. Today, we do have a CLMP and we use it in market power mitigation today. Today, the CLMP is based on a specific location, correct?
For BAA mitigation,
for local market power mitigation.
Oh, for local, yes, we do have a location that is considered to be competitive, and we we transform the shift factors in the system, because you're talking local market power mitigation, we're using shift factors for that. So we transform them to a reference at that location, at that competitive location, so that then we can go and separate the marginal cost, the marginal congestion component of the LMP at any specific location to a competitive and non-competitive portion, and the competitive portion lumped up with the rest of the components defines the competitive LMP for that location. Now, this specific reference for the shift factors has been, and it still is, either the Vincent bus or the Midway bus in the ISO backbone 500 kV system, and the selection or the choice depends on the dominant flow. So if there's north to south flow, it's the north bus on that interface that is selected. If south to north is the south bus that is selected, because that is considered to be a competitive location.
Thanks, George. Sorry, Callie, I saw your question and I took it 16 steps forward. But in short, yes, we do have a competitive LMP today. We use it for local market power mitigation. The reference is a competitive location, and that allows us to efficiently decompose the uncompetitive component at different locations across the market.
And I do see J.K. Wang raise your hand, and Callie Wells. So let's go ahead and unmute J.K. Sorry.
Hi, this is J.K. Wang from PG&E. Thank you, George and Sylvia, to answer my question. We will have a new definition of competitive MAG in the proposal. The CAISO will come up. I understand that it will be based on the competitive group we're seeing. If there are multiple competitive groups, which is possible, George, I just want to clarify, I understand that will be the lowest price of all the competitive groups. Is that right?
That is correct. When you find a group that is competitive, you may have BAAs in that group that have different marginal energy costs, and they were simply grouped in the process. But the last one that you added is the one that has the lowest marginal energy cost in the group, and that's the competitive one that you will use for mitigating uncompetitive BAAs in that group.
Okay. Do you have any insight? I know there may be proofs for that, but do you have any insight? Is that price the same as the system MAG? I'm just curious.
We are not using the system marginal energy cost anymore in EDAM. Each BAA has its own marginal energy cost. So, as I said, it's the MEC of the last group you added. Let's say that you're going through the process, grouping BAAs in the sequence that we discussed previously with an algorithm, right? I don't know if you remember, where you go from high MEC to low MEC in this process. And let's say your next step, you add the ISO balancing authority area. I'm just picking up the ISO balancing, it could be anyone. And then when you add that to your previous group, the new group that includes now the ISO, you test and you find out that it's competitive. Well, the lowest MEC in that group is the MEC for the last BAA that you added. In this example, is the ISO. So in this example, the marginal energy cost for the ISO is the competitive LMP that you will be using to mitigate BAAs in that group that they were previously found uncompetitive. They don't become competitive just because they're grouped with other BAAs and the group becomes competitive. They're still uncompetitive that they were found earlier. And you're using that competitive LMP to mitigate the bids in these BAAs. Now, in this example, I use the ISO as the last BAA that you added. It could have been another BAA, maybe Portland General, and then it will be the MEC of PGE. That is the competitive LMP. So it depends on the process. Okay.
Okay. That's really helpful. Okay, I have a tricky question. You don't have to answer me now. Just in a case like all the groups are non-competitive, how do you define a competitive MAG?
It's not a tricky question. It's a good one. I think we answered it in the previous meeting that we had. It's an edge scenario where you keep adding BAAs and your groups are always failing. And you finally add the last one that has the lowest MEC, and you still can't pass the test, which means your entire system is uncompetitive. Right. The answer is there is no competitive LMP. So you're using 0 as a demarcation in your mitigation. Your competitive LMP is 0, if you will. So the entire bid is mitigated when you go into mitigation. There is no threshold to say I'm only mitigating above the competitive LMP. Since there is no competitive LMP, the entire bid is mitigated, replaced by the lower of the bid or the DEB. Okay?
Got it. Okay. Well, think about it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Still have Callie on the line?
Yes.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I just want to make sure I understood kind of the response to my question. So you guys are now changing the definition of what a competitive LMP is for local market power mitigation. Did I understand that at a very high level?
No. We thank you, Sylvie. We are not changing that. We're not touching local market power mitigation, right? It stays the same. So the competitive LMP for local market power mitigation is still the competitive portions of the LMP at the location you're evaluating, right?
Oh, so the tariff says it's the LMP minus the non-competitive congestion component. So, yes. Right. So
I said exactly the same thing the other way. It's the competitive portion.
So we're going to have 2 competitive LMPs then, one for BAA and one for local?
Actually, you have a lot more than that.
At one specific location. At one specific location.
So for one specific location, there is a competitive LMP for local market power mitigation at that location, and there is a competitive LMP for marginal energy cost mitigation at that location, which is the same for the BAA.
That was what I was trying to get at. Thank you.
There's one competitive LMP, and it is made up of the contribution of BAA level and local market power. So it's not like you're facing 2 different LMPs. There's one competitive LMP. The way we got to it relies on those 2 separate processes.
Thank you, Sylvie. The components of the competitive LMP are these 2, but you put them together when you're going to mitigate a bid, right?
Yes. So okay. I will think through this. I think there's some examples where you might end up with different competitive LMPs, but I'll think through that and maybe shoot you over some examples. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to talk about how this all works together. We have a test, the Dynamic Competitive Path Assessment, which uses the 3 pivotal supplier test to figure out if there is a barrier preventing competitive supply from getting somewhere. So a binding constraint, either via scheduling or physical constraints, can cut off access to competitive supply. But this means that price isn't a great indicator of market power. Low prices do not indicate a lack of market power. High prices do not indicate market power. It's just about whether or not these constraints bind. So this test does not tell us if and to what extent a supplier is actually exercising market power. It tells us whether a supplier has the ability to, given the fact that they're cut off from external supply. This test doesn't attempt to assess the profitability of offers or the impact of offers on market prices. That's what the CLMP does. The competitive LMP is a good indicator of whether suppliers are exercising the market power that they have. And I'll move through an example that explains that. So if a supply offer is above the competitive LMP, that indicates that it has the ability to impact market prices and is potentially profitable. So the DCPA tells us where and through what submarket suppliers can exercise market power. In uncompetitive conditions in an uncompetitive area, a supplier that's attempting to exert market power would only be dispatched. The supplier attempting to exert market power would be dispatched, and the uncompetitive offer would impact market prices in that area and could yield profitable outcomes. And so the competitive LMP serves as this like cutoff point that indicates to us whether a supplier with market power is able or is exercising it. So we'll go back to my example where we have 3 units, units 1, 2, and 3. Unit 1 does not get mitigated because its bid is not above the CLMP. Unit 3 would get mitigated, even though in my example that I'll show you, it doesn't end up getting dispatched, but this is because its bid is above the CLMP. Not only does it have market power, but it has the ability to impact prices given that the competitive price is $45. So let me set this up in an example first. We've got 2 BAs, BAA and BAA-B. BAA, let's pretend that there's an infinite and aggregate source of supply and it costs $45 per megawatt hour. In BAA-B, we have 3 units. They each have the ability to exercise market power. Unit 1 submits an offer of $35 per megawatt hour. Unit 2 submits a $50 per megawatt hour offer. Unit 3, $60 per megawatt hour. Load in BAA-B is 500 megawatts. So what we should expect when we figure out what the CLMP is the prevailing price if the relevant constraints are not enforced. There's actually a little fun history here where I think like 15 years ago, before the CLMP was a thing, we actually had 2 market passes. In the first market pass, we did not enforce uncompetitive constraints. And then the second market pass, we did enforce the uncompetitive constraints and then compared the two to see if there was a change in dispatch. This is because when a constraint is enforced, uncompetitive offers can clear and impact prices. So we would not expect to see a change in dispatch from a supplier that's not exercising market power, but we would expect to see a change in dispatch from a supplier that is able to and is exercising market power. So we go back to our example. I put a transfer limitation at the bottom, but here we're not going to enforce it. So the marginal energy cost in BAA with its infinite supply of $45 per megawatt hour generation is $45 per megawatt hour. Because we have infinite supply and because there's no transfer limitation, we'll dispatch unit 1 at $35 per megawatt hour, and then the MEC in BAB is also going to be set at $45 per megawatt hour. So this should be the competitive LMP. When we don't enforce the transfer constraint, we end up seeing an increase in dispatch from Unit 2. Unit 2 not only has the ability to exercise market power, but is exercising it here because its offer price is impacting market prices. And we see price separation between the 2 BAs. So price separation by itself doesn't tell us that there's market power, but it is an indication that there's market power. So now let's see how the CLMP plays in. Unit 1 doesn't get mitigated. Oh, I've put each of the resources DEBs in green. So unit 1 doesn't get mitigated, and this is because it's below the CLMP, so it doesn't make a difference anyway. And if you wanted to pretend like unit 1's DEB is its true cost, you could say, okay, the offer price of $35 is inflated, but every incremental dollar above that DEB doesn't yield any benefits for this resource. It's not yielding incremental revenue or profitability, and it's not impacting market prices. So there's no reason, no matter what the difference is between the DEB and the energy offer, there's no reason to mitigate unit 1. Unit 2 gets mitigated at the competitive LMP, which in this case is also above that resource's DEB. And this prevents this resource's $50 offer from impacting market prices and provides competitive counterflow to the constraints. Unit 3 is mitigated down to its DEB, which in this case is above the competitive LMP. And I'll note that all resources at a given location are subject to this type of mitigation, even if they aren't actually dispatched. So if we did it a different way, if we didn't use the CLMP, we might see some differences in the outcomes. For example, the solution changes if we don't use the CLMP and instead we end up mitigating G2 down to its DEB. Now we actually go beyond limiting bids to just what we need to provide competitive counterflow to the constraint, and this reverses the flow of energy from BAA to BAB. And in this case, what we're actually doing is displacing generation from BAA that is otherwise totally competitive. And this could be problematic if the DEB of unit 2 isn't precise. So the CLMP is cool because it limits mitigation to only what is necessary to offer competitive counterflow to a non-competitive constraint. And it means that bids from units that have market power but are bidding below the CLMP tell us that those resources are likely not exercising their market power. Unit 1 doesn't benefit from increasing its offer price above its DEB, nor does the inflated offer above the DEB impact market prices. If we mitigate below the CLMP, we could displace supply that does not have the ability to exercise market power and is submitting otherwise competitive offers. And we could mute efficient price signals if in areas where the DEB isn't precise. And so together, the DCPA and the competitive LMP reduce the potential for over-mitigation. The DCPA reduces over-mitigation in competitive conditions by allowing market-based prices to prevail without mitigation, and this reduces the overall frequency of mitigation. The precision of this test relies on our definition of pivotal, and impact depends on how mitigation is implemented. So the competitive LMP reduces mitigation in conditions where suppliers do have the ability to exercise market power. And this can reduce the impact of mitigation. This does rely on our ability to accurately identify the competitive contribution to the CLMP. If we don't get the input right, we're not going to get the output right. All right. I'm going to move on to more of a discussion, compare and contrast, and a little bit of a discussion of the impact test. Before I do we have questions? Yeah.
Yes, we do. Eric Little, let's go ahead and take his question. Eric, you might be double muted. We can't hear you still.
Let's try it again. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Eric Little from Cal CCA. Sorry about that. Can you go back to slide 36, please? Okay, in this example, I just want to make sure I understand. Unit 1 then, if there's a 100 megawatt transfer limit back to BAAA, was that a 400 megawatt unit to begin with?
Let's see. So in this, for unit 1, we dispatch that up to 300 megawatts. And then unit 2 would be dispatched to, I guess we're indifferent after we dispatch unit 1 between supply from BAAA and supply from unit 2.
Okay, I guess what I'm curious
either
about
way.
What I'm
Sorry,
curious about here
continue.
is if unit 1 was a 300 megawatt unit and it could transfer 100 megawatts to BAAA, it seems like you'd only have 200 megawatts left. So that was one of my question was, did it start off as a 400 megawatt unit and it's already dispatching 100 megawatts to serve BAAA?
It doesn't matter. You could actually, if you want to play around with this to prove it to yourself, I recommend that. But at the end of the day, like if 200 megawatts of unit 1 is going to BAA or BAB, the clearing price is still going to be $45.
Okay, I guess I'm just trying to make sure that it's taking account of all transactions that are going to happen before it starts applying the market power mitigation, correct?
Yeah, and here the transactions that happen are all net. So it doesn't matter if there's like a back and forth, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
We have one more question, JK. We can't hear you.
Hi, this is JK Wang from PG. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Sylvia, my apologies if you mentioned this and missed that. So all of this is assume that the market power mitigation is already triggered and we have tested BAB has market power. Is that correct?
So in this example, we have on the screen, we have already calculated the competitive LMP, correct?
Okay, so is there anywhere we're going to discuss what is the trigger and how do we determine the BA has market power? I guess there was a session we talked about the grouping methodology, but I just want to make sure if there's any change, if we're going to revisit that again.
So I wasn't planning on doing that today. I was mostly planning on teeing up how the competitive LMP works. I don't think everyone is as further as you in terms of understanding how this works and what the grouping methodology would solve. So I tried to keep it higher level. But I actually, when I was thinking about this,
that's very fair. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah, this is really helpful. And I just want to say that when you explained how the competitive MAC works, my initial thought it's a more fair assumption than today, as we have the BA MAC assumed always to be competitive, which is also assumed the overall system is competitive. So the new definition you're given, my initial thought it is better definition. Thank you.
Thanks, JK. And just to round out something that I was thinking when JK was asking her question, on the previous slide where we already found the competitive LMP, we had already found the competitive LMP. On this slide, we haven't yet. And I just wanted to note that toggling that transfer limit, to me, is a really useful way to understand where the competitive LMP comes from. And if you want to play around with your own examples, this is a good starting point. Any other questions?
No more questions.
Okay. So key takeaways here. I'm just going to land here for a second. The CLMP is a really useful tool to tell us when resources or where resources have the ability to exercise market power, do their offers indicate that they're doing it? So let's start thinking about next steps, assessments, potential areas of evolution. First, I wanted to note that the two FERC-approved NPM philosophies, what we do compared to conduct and impact, are actually pretty similar in principle. We define the competitive offers using a cost-based offer, and this is validated against reference levels that the ISO and market monitors validate and approve of. And there's a second proxy, which is a prevailing market price absent binding constraints. In conduct and impact, this is pretty much the same thing, but it's a market-based offer that cannot impact market prices. So it's two different ways of looking at the same thing. Under conditions for mitigation, the ISO's market power mitigation looks at barriers to competition. Does a supplier have the ability to exercise market power given constraints? And what is the offer price in excess of competitive levels that has the ability to impact market prices because of that barrier? In conduct and impact, we're doing an economic assessment. What is the potential profitability of offer prices that exceed cost-based offers? And does that profitability negatively impact consumers? But we saw in my examples that the CLMP helps us get to this same idea, where it shows us whether or not a supplier's offer in excess of the DEB is able to impact prices and is able to yield profitability. So while the principles are fairly similar, they do diverge in practice because of how we go about doing it. So the CLMP is this one neat trick. It's a market-based price. It reflects structurally competitive areas. It's a good secondary proxy for interval-specific market conditions. Whereas designing an impact threshold comes with some challenges. A lot of impact thresholds at other ISOs and RTOs are static and therefore do not capture interval-specific market conditions. They also might be based on historical structural evaluations, which might get you more precision, but again, isn't dynamic. The final thing that I think is cool about the competitive LMP is that it facilitates a computationally simple solution. I mentioned that in the olden days, about 15 years ago, we had a two-pass market power mitigation structure, and we wrapped that into a single pass by coming up with a competitive LMP. But it does a couple of things. It means that we don't need to test the individual impact of each resource. It means that we don't need to mitigate anything below the CLMP. And all of this is helpful because it reduces the potential for getting a different solution between mitigation and your binding market run. In fact, the reason why we came up with a competitive LMP in the first place was to mitigate the potential for backfill from unmitigated resources after we mitigated in the first place. So basically what we've done is replaced what could otherwise be a multi-market process guess and check with a one-step procedure by using the competitive LMP to estimate that cutoff where suppliers would otherwise impact prices. So now I want to talk about some problem statements and potential solutions and how all of this interacts. So first, let's talk about the competitive LMP. There might be potential for error, either false negatives or false positives, if the way that we determine the BA level contribution to the competitive LMP is incorrect. We could over-mitigate if the efficient CLMP is greater than the one that we've identified. We could under-mitigate if the efficient LMP is lower than the one that we've identified. And there's a couple of solutions to this, as JK is already ahead of us on. We can increase the precision of the CLMP by considering a grouping methodology to derive the efficient MEC for mitigation. We can also consider how we characterize the pivotal supplier. Both of these solutions are fairly holistic. They would increase the precision of our inputs, and that would increase the precision of our outputs. Other solutions on the table address the potential for over-mitigation only. For one potential problem statement is we could see over-mitigation when suppliers are getting mitigated when they do not have the ability to exercise market power. Solution to this would be small fish swim free. The potential for over-mitigation also might exist when suppliers are getting over-mitigated if the CLMP serves as the binding mitigation floor. This is the same problem statement as on the previous slide. We're just ignoring the potential for under-mitigation. So one solution is the grouping approach, but the other solution here would be the impact threshold. If we think the CLMP is systematically over-mitigating and never under-mitigating, an impact threshold could reduce the impact of that. And this is sort of logical. Remember that anything above the CLMP impacts market outcomes. So to apply an impact threshold to the existing design, all we would do is CLMP plus X, and that X would represent the impact threshold. There are some potential trade-offs, including an increase in the potential for over-mitigation and an increase in computational intensity. But remember, the CLMP is one of two proxies that we use in market power mitigation procedure. So we can't just think about the CLMP, we might think about the DEB as well. So the potential for over or under mitigation might occur if the DEB is greater or less than a resource's true cost-based offer. Existing solutions might include only mitigating bids above the CLMP. This ensures that even if a DEB is imprecise, if the offer is below the CLMP, nothing happens. Also, we have lots of opportunities today for DEB customization and adjustments. But I want to consider what it would mean to solve this problem with an impact test. Does this solve the problem? Is there a formulation that solves the problem? What are the trade-offs here?
Sylvie, this is James.
Yeah.
Could I wanted to offer a quick clarification on slide 46, if I could. I just wanted to point out that the term small fish swim free is a nickname for the concept of mitigating only pivotal suppliers that we talked about in one of the November workshops. So if you're unfamiliar with that nickname, that's what we're talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Okay. So issues that might arise around the DEB today, doesn't matter if your DEB is wrong or right. If your bid is below the CLMP, we don't mitigate you. And so in that instance, any error around the DEB has no impact. We also have a lot of opportunities for you to get your DEB right, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides. But first, I want to go through the thought exercise of a couple of different ways we might design an impact test and discuss how and what problem this would really solve with respect to the CLMP or the DEB. So I've got a sort of extreme example here where the competitive LMP reflects an oversupply of VERS. Remember, one of the relative constraint comes from if you have an abundance of supply on the other side and you hit your limit. So in the examples before, I just labeled it as infinite supply. Here we have VERS. It's a sunny day. It's a windy day in May. So we've got binding constraints everywhere, and the CLMP reflects those VERS. I have three resources here: gas resource 1, gas resource 2, and hydro 1. The DEB that the ISO calculates for these resources are 55, 70, and 197 respectively. And then I've also put in a theoretical real cost. So gas 1's real cost is $50, so that's $5 less than its DEB. Gas 2's real cost is $75, that's $5 more than its DEB. And hydro costs $230 in this particular interval. So each of these has a somewhat different problem. For gas 1, the DEB is over its cost, which is greater than the CLMP. For the other two resources, their cost is greater than their DEBs, which are greater than the CLMP. So what would the impact adder, so to speak, on the CLMP need to be to address the issues with these three resources? Well, for gas 1, it would be a -5. For gas 2 and hydro, it would be a positive number. And the challenge here is that today we have one CLMP at each location, and that gets applied to all resources. So if we have a single number and a single impact adder, what should that look like? So I came up with three rough ways of going about this. Solution 1 is a static composite function. This is what a lot of conduct and impact tests look like, where you do where you multiply the DEB by a percentage or you add a number on there. So here I've done that, but to the CLMP. If you've got a CLMP that reflects a high VER supply, a percentage threshold wouldn't be effective, but also given the distribution of different prices that we're looking at, the adders would also largely either overestimate all costs or not solve the problem at all. So thinking about something that could maybe leverage market information and be a little bit more specific or more precise, what if we designed a CLMP that's intended to correct for max error or average error? But to do that, we would need a lot of information, and we're now thinking about a CLMP that's not just dynamic for competitive conditions, but dynamic with respect to the bids that are being submitted, and they would require a knowledge of error around the DEBs. But we already have a process for that. The DEBs themselves account for potential cost error by having multipliers. And if specific resources have better cost information than what is being used to calculate the DEB, we have processes that you can go through to request DEB adjustments. The third solution might be coming up with something technology specific, so a technology specific CLMP adder. This also comes with some challenges, including the fact that it would be dynamic, and then we would need a CLMP for each technology type. And also we'd need to start thinking about policy questions like what impact are we willing to tolerate per technology type and resource? And I note that the DEB sort of serves this purpose already, but the question is different. For DEBs, we're not asking how much market power or what impact are we willing to tolerate. For DEBs, the question is, how much cost variation should we account for? So this would be a different question. And I'm going to come back to that slide just in case people want to discuss it more or ask questions. But a couple of things I wanted to highlight are that there are lots of opportunities today to get your DEB right. The multipliers can be evaluated and modified via policy processes for the default DEB types. Also, scheduling coordinators can establish a resource-specific multiplier through the negotiated DEB process. Plus, there are opportunities to request hourly or daily cost adjustments through the reference level change request process. And again, the responsibility is on the scheduling coordinator to ensure that their DEB inputs and their DEB formulas capture their costs appropriately. And there's also a couple of ways where the ISO will make DEB and reference level modifications based on dynamic and observed market conditions. For gas resources, for example, if the ISO observes that there's a lot of volatility or there's a change in price in same-day gas markets, we might modify reference levels. If we see multiple manual requests in a given area, we'll modify reference levels. And we have something called a frequently mitigated unit adjustment, which is an adder that gets added to a resource's reference level if they are frequently mitigated. So the punchline here is that these two types of market power tests, local market power mitigation and BAA level market power mitigation, are both necessary and distinct tests. Local market power mitigation alone is not sufficient. Price separation between markets does not indicate market power, just as conduct alone is not sufficient. Our DCPA is not sufficient. We then use the CLMP to determine if bids need to be mitigated. The overall or relative price level of offer prices does not indicate an ability or the actual exercise of market power. Absolute prices are not a reflection of market power exercise. And finally, we have lots of tools to prevent mitigation below cost. And many of these tools are resource specific, whereas an impact test to the CLMP would require some design and work to get to the same level of precision. And that's the end of my presentation. So maybe I'll go back a couple of slides to see if there's any desire to talk more about what it means to add an impact test into the mix.
Let's go with J.K. Wang.
This is J.K. Wang from PG&E. I really appreciated this presentation. This is very helpful. So Sylvia, I want to ask you, for the conduct and impact test, are we discussing to add it addition to the DCPA and CLMP test, or this is like more of a replacement? Are we saying or DCPA plus CLMP or the conduct and impact test, or does it end the question?
So the comments from stakeholders so far have reflected a curiosity, I think, more so than an actual proposal. But I think that the temperature is really around how do we integrate an impact test into the existing design, and what problem would that solve? So I tried to answer that here, where I offer the idea that the CLMP is your baseline for impact. And so if we wanted to answer the question, does this offer impact prices, then we would do that by adding something to the CLMP to say, we will only mitigate if an offer impacts prices by X dollars.
Okay, so are we suggesting that CLMP is sufficient and we don't need a conduct and impact test here?
I think that's the question that stakeholders should be answering. I'm just providing a framework to better understand what the role of the competitive LMP is and what potential solutions might address any issues. So earlier we were talking about the grouping methodology, and I think that's a great way to increase the precision of the CLMP itself. So I think we're looking for stakeholder feedback on what problem the impact test would solve, or if and where we're seeing a problem that the impact test would solve.
Okay. According to your knowledge, are there any other markets using the impact test without CLMP?
I actually think the CLMP is unique to the CAISO's market design, which means that no one is using a CLMP plus impact test.
Okay, and all the other markets are using conduct and impact test?
Not all other markets use conduct and impact test. There's a combination of pure conduct and impact. There's some do a version of the 3 pivotal supplier test. And I think there's there's some combinations of both out there. But no one actually uses the CLMP.
Okay, that's really helpful. And another question, just a follow up on Kelly's in our last slide. So the change of CLMP will change the LMP of local market power mitigation because that's a component of that. Is that right?
Right. So our discussions around how to formulate the CLMP would impact local market power mitigation.
Okay.
Well, it wouldn't impact the test itself. It would impact outcomes at specific locations.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair because it's a component of it.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I think James would like to add also, Sylvie. Oh, never mind. Lowered his hand.
I was going to add the same point that JK and Sylvie conceded at the end, that it doesn't change the input into local market power mitigation, but it could change the output because the competitive MEC is a component of all CLMPs, and therefore, if the competitive MEC were to change from what we're doing today, then thereby competitive LMPs as you know them today could look differently, which is essentially what you guys agreed upon at the end. Thanks.
One question from Callie Wells.
Hi, it's
Callie.
Callie. Yeah, hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Okay, so I really appreciate you guys kind of thinking through different ways you can add an impact threshold within the framework you guys have put forth here. I just want to make sure I understand kind of I think you had like 3 different potential solutions or ways to formulate this. Because when I think of a conduct and impact test, on the impact side, it's let's rerun the market and see if by changing your bid, you've impacted the price at your location by a certain amount, which seems to be somewhat different than what you have here. This is more of, and I'm going to probably put this very in a very naive way, so apologies ahead of time. It's basically like you're adding a buffer to the competitive LMP to make sure we don't mitigate too far down. Am I understanding that correct?
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that the CLMP itself tells us if there's an impact on market prices. So the CLMP, and by coming up with a CLMP and then comparing bids to it, we don't have to rerun the market. The CLMP is sort of like the magic sauce that allows us to do this in a single market run by saying, where are these bids compared to the CLMP? If it's under the CLMP, it won't have an impact on market prices, and it doesn't need to be mitigated, even if it's way above its DEB. If it's above the CLMP, then it's subject to mitigation. So the CLMP is that like efficient cutoff point that tells us if a supplier that has market power is exercising it and is impacting market prices.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. Something that, and I don't know, you said this was the end of your presentation, so I don't know if maybe at the next meeting you guys are going to get more into the pivotal supplier test approach itself, and if so, I can hold off my my questions regarding that. But I think we had an ask in our last comments for the CAISO to consider at least discuss or explore variations of that formula. So are you guys planning on discussing that at the next presentation by chance, or at the next meeting?
We can definitely do that. I've teed it up here just to make sure we know what we're talking about when we discuss characterization of the pivotal supplier. So we can put that on the agenda for next time.
Yeah, and I think our ask was more in what's included in the demand and the supply when you guys are calculating the RSI.
Okay, good question.
All right, thanks.
James, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could add on there. So that discussion about what's included in supply and demand of counterflow will come up next week. Next week, we're planning on presenting analysis that's looking at two things. First is to assess the BAA level competitiveness of the CAISO BAA, and using that information to help us determine as a working group whether the CAISO BA should continue to be excluded from the BA test or not. And then second, we're putting together counterfactual analysis to assess using the grouping algorithm that was presented in November, what the impact might be on the frequency of mitigation in the WEIM. And so as part of that discussion, especially in the first part where we're talking about running the competitiveness assessment, we'll make sure to include some transparency around what's being included in the supply and demand counterflow equations to help, and recognizing that for whatever reason those calculations are difficult to locate in our public business practice manuals, and so hopefully that can provide some more transparency there. Thank you.
Okay, great. I really appreciate that. And if there's any way, I guess the ask would be, just because it sounds like that might be a very detailed and technical discussion, if there's a chance you guys can post the slides, a day or two in advance so we can digest it ahead of time, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions? Anyone want to chew on any of these topics out loud, or are we all experts in what the CLMP is?
I don't see any more further questions at this time.
All right. In that case, I can hand it back to you, Brenda.
Thank you, Sylvie. Great job. And we appreciate your background on this topic. We also want to remind folks that we have provided a few chat inquiries on different links referencing the previous BAA level market power mitigation workshop we had last year, and that one's linked there and also on our Stakeholder Center under Price Formation Enhancements Phase 2. Moving a little bit forward, let me make sure. So any questions referencing for price formation, please feel free to reach out to the ISO Stakeholder Affairs at GISO.com. We'll be monitoring any questions on that. And then also, we do have notices that just went out today for that price formation enhancement working group call and schedule next week on Thursday, the 13th, as James mentioned. So that notice is out and confirmed. We also provided a notice for the upcoming market performance and planning forum on March 20th. We have moved that date from a previous date, so that date will be standing for the 20th. We do have topics from market and advance and analytics team with Guillermo's team. They'll be presenting on a few topics that are presented on the agenda. So we posted the agenda as well for the upcoming first quarter market performance and planning forum. And additionally, for those who are following us on the other initiative, we do have CR enhancements. That is also a working group that we just had a meeting last week. That meeting also has a follow-up discussion next week on the 12th. And Guillermo's team will be having an unstructured, informal meeting to answer any questions on CR enhancements that he presented last week on his 200 over slides for that meeting. So we do look forward for those stakeholders to participate in that meeting if they have additional follow-up. And at this time, the last slide I would like to present is on the energy blog matters. We just launched an article in regards to the RC West, how we are starting to kick off the spring from March to May on maintenance. So that's a great visual and representation of what we're doing. And so we will have that blog just available for everyone who likes to read about it. And you can also see Raja's input on that as well, as he's also leading on our RC West meetings. So with that, I don't see any more questions in queue. Thanks so much. And hopefully everyone stays safe, and I'll pass it back to Ahmed, my event producer. Thank you.
This event has concluded. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.